Some of you may be confused right now. You may be wondering, why isn't he reviewing something new? What is this? A lot of you guys may have never even heard of this album. It's because this is an older album, and I'm talking about it because once in a blue moon on this channel, I like to do classic reviews. For those of you who don't know, these are for albums, movies, maybe at some point I'll do a TV show as well that are at least 10 years old. And I'm setting it to a minimum of 15 years. It has to be at least 15 years old. That's what I'm going to consider a classic. 15 years, 15 years, 15 years. Yeah, I know I said that before. Look, there's stuff from 2008, 2012. I'm mentioning those years because those are the 5 years after 2007, which is 15 years before now. There's movies and albums from that time that I might want to talk about, and a decade feels appropriate for something to be considered a classic, I think. Basically, the short version of what I'm trying to get to is that I'd like to do these every so often. I'd like to keep my reviews to be mostly new releases, and I don't want to do this too much to where it doesn't become sort of a special occurrence. I want it to be kind of rare and be cool when I do one of these things. It doesn't necessarily even have to be something I like, just something that's very beloved by all other people, or something that's popular or has some sort of iconic status, a notable place in pop culture, if you will. I sort of break it down in my playlist that I have for classic album and movie reviews. If you want to read into that, it's more of a direct description of what I'm trying to get at here. Long intro, maybe too long of an intro aside, this is XXX, or as some people call it, 30, the second studio album by the rapper Danny Brown. And this is really the first album from Danny that put him on the map, made him a somewhat mainstream artist, because sure, the Hybrid a year before this, had generated a decent amount of hype around Danny and around his music, around his personality. But this is really where he sort of broke into the spotlight, and it's what made his following album, Old, a huge success, and even saw him working with some pretty big artists such as Freddie Gibbs and A$AP Rocky. And it's an album that I feel like really showcases Danny at the best of both worlds, because you have him being his normal wisecracking self, all of these dirty ass lyrics, his very over the top, somewhat high pitched flow going on, which he does very well. But then there's some very introspective lyricism on here. He switches his flow up a little bit in the second half, which I'll get to a little bit later about the way that the album is constructed. But it's a really good, I think, meeting of the minds. In this case, Danny Brown's sort of two, his comical side and his more serious side when it comes to his music and his art. I think the album starts out pretty cool with the opening track, which is the self-titled track XXX, and it pretty much feeds right into the idea of him wanting to become more well-known, more acclaimed, as he's talking about, he needs to be successful, he needs to have this, and he needs to have this notoriety and this spot in the hip-hop culture. And then Die Like a Rockstar, in my mind, is pretty much sort of his way of saying that this is what will happen if I don't achieve this success and I don't do what I'm trying to do here. And he name drops various different rock musicians like Kurt Cobain or Bradley Nowell. That sublime line with Bradley Nowell is awesome. And the beat to this thing is nasty, it's distorted, it's heavy. It really does actually have a sort of rap rock sensation going for it, which is, of course, very fitting for the concept it's talking about. Pac Blood is sort of his way of telling us just how he is as an artist, what his writing process is like. Basically, it's almost like some sort of advertisement for this is what you'll get from listening to my music. That's at least the interpretation I get from the overarching lyrics in the song. Of course, there are other lines, other bars that don't really fit under that idea, but overall, that's sort of the message I get from it. And man, Radio Song is super hard-hitting, super self-aware. He is pretty much saying in the song that this is not my radio song. I know I kind of need one to be a bigger artist, but don't expect any of these types of tracks on here. It's sort of like if the song Hook by Blues Travelers just had a little more grit and a little more intensity to it. With the track Life For, he's sort of just talking about how he's gotten to this point, the work he's had to put in to get to where he is, And though I will say I'm not quite as into his ad-libs on this one, I think the track goes over pretty well, and I love that little string instrument that comes in the refrain. I can't think of which one specifically it is, but it's super nice, super tasteful. I Will is a song on this album where he talks about, yeah, if you've heard the album, it kind of goes without saying, but basically if you're not familiar with it, he look, I do find the song entertaining. You know, like I said earlier, Danny is super funny, not only in real life but with his music as well. He's pretty much always just finds a way to entertain me, at least. So it's definitely an enjoyable listen for me, but it's also easily not one of my favorite tracks on the album, and not one that I always go back to as often. And I would say the same about Bruiser Brigade. Topically, I don't mind this song at all, talking about the effects of drinking and how this has affected him and other of his friends in his life. And I do also like the dope head feature at the end quite a bit. I like how the song kind of just ends, but then just pops right back in and he closes things out. It's a pretty cool way to finish the track. Detroit 187 sees Danny talking a little bit about his hometown Detroit and about the violence that goes on, and specifically the murder that happens in his town. Monopoly somewhat picks up where Pot Blood left off, except this time around he's much more confident sounding and much more braggadocious with his delivery. Then we get the smoking anthem that is blunt after blunt, which is actually pretty cool to hear, because when I first heard Danny Ryan, I thought he sounded a lot like the guys from Cypress Hill. You know, those guys are obviously very much into smoking weed. And so, I don't know, it's kind of cool. This is sort of like his imitation of Cypress Hill in a way. And I think it's a pretty damn good track. I love this grimy ass beats. It goes insane. And I like Danny's flow in this one as well. It's a little bit slower, but there's more growl and rasp to it. And in a way, it kind of makes a statement without making one, because it's sort of like not condoning doing drugs at all or smoking weed in this instance, but of course you hear it, you think like, yeah, smoke weed every day. I like that it's not quite as easily digestible as it would seem, and there's just more that meets the eye. Outer Space is a cool track as well. I like specifically the drums in this beat. They're a little bit scattered, kind of discombobulated, not very much structure to them, but I think it's pretty cool. And man, I love Danny's lyrics in this one. They're dirty as hell, but I actually think that there's some pretty good wordplay. Like when he says, swore she played soccer, she was real good with headers, having yelling goal while I was sitting on the dresser. And then later he says, I got them penis poems for your vagina monologues. Well done. Well done, Danny. Well done. Then Admiral is a pretty trippy way to close out this first side. It's very short, abrupt track, but it's super cool, and I love the transitions between each verse, as it kind of, the guitar, there's like this very light strumming throughout it, and then it gets a little bit more heavier and louder between verses, but then just comes to this very quick halt right before the start of the next verse. It's honestly kind of chilling. And then we get to the song DNA, which is the start of side B and is a complete shift in tone for the album. I mean, it's completely different. The production is different. Even Danny's flow, his delivery is a little bit more stern. He's clearly not joking around as much anymore. This is a much more serious side to the album, which I kind of alluded to earlier. A lot of people don't realize that that was kind of how a lot of albums were done, how they used to be done. Side A would have a specific tone to it, or maybe a specific vibe, a theme going on, and side B would be kind of the opposite of that, or at least pretty different from that. An album that comes to mind that's kind of like that is Green by R.E.M., whereas the first side of the album is kind of a little bit more on the pop side, more radio friendly, and the second half was kind of more heavy for them, or as the band called it, the air side, side A, and side B was the metal side. That's how albums used to be done, and I like that Danny is kind of throwing it back to that style, and I think it gets off to a great start with DNA. I love the G-Funk influence on this one, as well as the chorus, very much in line with the idea of DNA, talking about his family and how he's kind of repeating after his family. Nosebleeds is a pretty sad song where he's talking about this girl. We are to assume that she might be a partner, or maybe she's just a friend of his who is a cocaine addict, and he's kind of just watching her lose her ways, and he doesn't really have a way of helping her out, but I think he tells the story very well. And even though it's a very small part of it, I really like the crisp bass tone that we hear on Party All the Time, and in addition to the lyrics as well. I mean, gosh, this album just is filled with so many good lyrics, but this is just another case of that. And it kind of picks up where the last track left off in a way. East, west, north, east, southwest, sort of sees Danny reflecting on his childhood, living in Detroit as a kid, and sort of how there was this difference between which part of the city you would live in, and there would just be different things that would be going on in the different areas of the town. Field is another one that is about Detroit, except this time it's much more about just all of the negative memories he had from it, from seeing what other people were doing, from his own experience doing drugs, living out on the streets. And I think that the chorus to this song is honestly kind of brilliant. When I first heard it, I was confused, but you know, he says it was house, field, 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 house, you know, saying that's where I lived. It just paints such a good picture. You can just picture it like house, and then just all this land and then another house. Like there's just hardly really anything there, not much of really a good family life to be developed in a place like that. And then Scrap or Die talks a little more on some of the unfortunate antics that Danny would partake in, and more specifically him and his family, as they would steal from homes, you know, sort of just make ends meet. They would have to kind of just take stuff from other people's homes when they were vacant homes. And I really like the anxious sound of this track. There's very much a feeling of anxiety going on with the instrumental, and a great use of percussion in this one as well. And I feel like 30 really just perfectly encapsulates everything that the album up to this point has been talking about. The first side and second side, it really is a good meeting of those two ideas. Kind of like the album as a whole is a good meeting of Danny's sort of two personalities that he has as an artist. And I just think it's a great finish. Yeah, so, you know, while this album sure is not quite as popular as other albums I could have talked about for a classic review, you know, like my last one was Imagine, you know, certainly not as big or maybe influential as that album is, it still does hold a pretty important place in the hip-hop world. It's, you know, very beloved by a lot of people, and you know, I don't want to say it's in the underground scene, but just for lack of a better term or word, in the underground scene, this is very much beloved, and I think rightfully so considered a classic and considered to be a great piece of work. It's what led to further success in his career, and I think rightfully so. It's a great project, and for me, it gets a 9.5 out of 10. What barely holds it down for me is, you know, maybe just a couple of tracks, him being just a little bit too over the top. It's a little much for my liking, but you know, even the two tracks on this album that I'm not as into, I still do kind of enjoy, just in comparison with the rest of the album. They're just slightly weak in my opinion. But yeah, this album is awesome. Love it. It's a classic, and I want to know what you guys think of it if you've heard it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video, hopefully coming soon. Peace out.